When I was a minister I told everyone, remember, I'm not the boss of the church and this is not my church. You only employed me. This is your church.
Benvenute e benvenuti a Senza mulini, storie di chiese plurali, che ogni 2 settimane vi porta in giro per il mondo a scoprire modi molteplici di vivere il cristianesimo. Oggi, direttamente da Cape Town in Sudafrica, Helené De Klerk ci racconta com'è essere una persona cristiana in Sudafrica, in un luogo in cui ci sono tante denominazioni diverse, con anche delle sfaccettature in alcuni casi molto contrastanti, le cui radici affondano direttamente nella cultura che ha permesso l'apartheid. Ci racconta della sua esperienza come ministra all'interno della Chiesa Riformata Olandese, da cui ha preso un anno sabbatico per approfondire i suoi studi di stampo psicologico, e di quali sono le questioni legate alla giustizia sociale particolarmente sentite in Sudafrica. Thank you for being here with me in Senza mulini. It's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
So start with introducing. I want to ask you to introduce yourself by saying who you are, where you live, and which Christian denomination you have experienced or are involved in now.
Yeah, okay. So my name is Helené De Klerk. I live in Cape Town in South Africa. So we're very south in the whole continent of Africa, right at the bottom. And we are very privileged. If we go to the beach, which is 1 kilometer from our house, we can see the perfect view of Table Mountain. So I'm very close to there. And we're finally having some spring now. We had a very cold winter, so we're really glad that spring is returning.
And would you like to tell us also which Christian denomination you have experienced in your life?
So you have sent me some information about all of the different denominations. And I was thinking, if you take all of the denominations in South Africa, it's almost like our rainbow nation with different cultures and different languages. We also have so many different denominations. I grew up in the Dutch Reformed Church. So that is one of the main Afrikaans churches in South Africa. And I guess the first institutional church in South Africa that started almost 400 years ago.
And what has been your relationship with Christianity during the years? You said that you have grown up in a community, but do you have a believing family, or did you discover or rediscover your faith as an adult? Do you feel part of a church? Do you struggle with it? What's your story?
Okay. So I grew up in Afrikaans, we call it a pastorie. It's the Afrikaans word, but my father was a minister, so I grew up in the church's home for quite a while, and then I also became a minister. After school, I went to university, to the seminary, and I also became a minister of the Dutch Reformed Church. And I was a minister for 11 years until January this year. I've been very privileged to study this year and next year to do a bit of counseling. So it's almost enriching or deepening my calling in ministry to serve people, I believe. So this year I've taken almost a little bit of a sabbatical from the church. We are a part of the local Dutch Reformed Church in Bloubergstrand, where I live. But I decided just for a little while I want to take a little bit of a breather. But yes, the church and faith has been my whole life.
It's been a long journey. And what it is like to be Christian in South Africa? I've read some statistics, and according to ERDA, around 82% of the population is Christian, 22.27 Protestant, 6.49 Catholic, but most significantly, from an Italian point of view, for sure, 41% is Christian independents, which have grown significantly over the last 40 years. And the second largest group is ethnic religionists.
Yes. And as I said, I think it's actually quite, I don't want to say scary, but disheartening in a certain way, because there's so many differences. I mean, your experience is actually limited to the amount of things that you can experience. Yeah, so South Africa is mostly a Christian country. I think I actually read this morning that that is the way most people would define themselves. If they actively practice Christianity, I'm not always so sure. But the history in South Africa with the church is very closely linked. I think because of a lot of Protestants coming from France, coming from the Netherlands to South Africa in the 1600s. So that, I think, has a very large impact in our church, in our country. Sometimes wonderful, but also sometimes not so great. I think especially the church that I'm a part of has been very closely linked to apartheid in the past. So I think all of these things makes us have some mixed feelings about Christianity sometimes. So we have to, I think the wonderful thing, our constitution makes place for it. But I think as people, we also have to live it, because we are so many different people. We have to make space for one another and one another's beliefs. So even though the Dutch Reformed Church, I think, is the biggest institutionalized church, not in numbers, I think, but in structure, and we are always the first ones who get into the newspaper. A lot of people know of that, but I think of a lot of other churches we don't know as much. And I think a lot of the ethnic churches, as they call it, is just less institutionalized. But I think their impact within communities are actually great, and it keeps communities close together, and they help each other to uphold one another, I almost want to say.
Thank you for this picture. Since you are talking about communities, I want to ask you, how do Christian communities and parishes work? Of course, there are a lot of differences, so for your experience, and what roles do lay people and clergy people play in it?
I always remember when I was a minister, I told everyone, remember, I'm not the boss of the church, and this is not my church. You only employed me. This is your church. And I think in most instances that is true. I think especially in the Black communities in South Africa, women carries the churches. They make sure that things run. Most of them will be the church council. They will keep the church running even if there isn't a minister or a priest. So I think people really play a big part. And I think people do community work, not necessarily always through the church, but lay people who are members of churches does a lot of stuff in communities to help feed people, to help children do homework. So I think I almost always want to say we get together in a congregation on a Sunday, but the real church happens within every day. So I think I don't know the Roman Catholic Church as well, but I think that is one of the main differences between the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, is that people are really involved in actually almost not governing, but leading what happens within the church and the community.
Yeah, this is a very big difference, because our, as Catholic parishes and communities, priest-centered. So yeah, of course, for the small one or the one who hasn't a priest staying there, having a house in there, of course they have to organize themselves, but almost always with a figure, can be a lay person, but that has a ministry which come from a priest. So this is a very big difference between our two different experiences. You talked about the experience of apartheid and churches and religious communities. So I want to ask you, in South Africa, even though apartheid ended decades ago, racial and economic disparities remain pressing issues. How do you see the role of religion and religious communities in addressing the modern day inequalities and supporting their ongoing quests for justice and reconciliation?
I think, in my opinion, I don't think that's always what happens in reality. Is if the church isn't busy doing something about that, then there's almost no point in being a church. That's obviously over exaggerating, but I feel that is what Jesus taught us. That's what we're supposed to do. I think I can mostly speak of my own church, because we are such a institutionalized church. We also have quite a bit of infrastructure, so we have a lot of buildings, but also I think around about the 50s, 60s, 1950s, 1960s, the Dutch Reformed Church also built a lot of old age homes, a lot of children's homes. So that gives a lot of structure to some of the community work that is happening. But I think that's a small part. I think the church I'm a part of, we had a very bad drought for many years, for I think almost 8 years. And some parts are still struggling quite a bit, especially the farmers who had to, most of them had to sell all of their livestock. And the church had so many fundraising all over the country for that. So when big stuff happens, they jump on the wagon. But I think also in the small, each congregation usually has a committee who runs a small amount of money, but that can help people in the community that struggles. But churches are also the institutions that make soup kitchens or have outreaches at night too. We have quite a bit of homelessness, so there's outreaches at night. But I think the main, I don't know if it's the main problem, but the sad thing for us is it's as though the economic disparity, I think that is way more than any race at the moment. I think as people, we just want everyone to do well. Excuse me. But the government, there's quite a bit of corruption in our government, which means that the money does not get to the infrastructure, doesn't get to the schools, doesn't get to the hospitals, and I think that is what is difficult for us, because we're almost fighting against this corrupt system. But even when that is happening, people just decide, well, we can do a bit to hold the government accountable, but it's not always possible. So if we can't always do that, we will try to help as much as possible. But the sad thing is, I think most of the time it's not sustainable, or it won't solve the problem. Rather, if the funds that from our tax money doesn't get where they're supposed to. So I think it's a difficult thing. According to the reconciliation, I always say our church's story runs very deep from that. My husband and I was driving past one of the churches close to us the other day, and I told him this is actually one of the first places where the congregants told people of color, you should stay in this part of the church while we have church. So it's a big part of our church, of our institution. But I'm so grateful that in spite of that, our church really also does a lot to try and reconcile that. we don't, we make a lot of faults along the way, and it takes a very long time. But I think at the moment we're at a good place. We have recently, I think in the past few years, been allowed back into the World Communion of Reformed Churches. And yeah, I was actually, before our chat, also we have a South African Council of Churches, which we are now also a part of. And I think especially that council, along with I think the Anglican Church in South Africa also does very wonderful work for reconciliation, for AIDS. I think they are also very wonderful. After apartheid, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which did wonderful work, but was stopped at a certain stage. But out of that, and mostly from the Anglican Church, but I think we are also a bit part of it, an organization called Healing of Memories started. So there's a lot of work being done. Unfortunately, we also have limited funds, so you can also only do as much as you can. But I think that is one of the things that the church wants and really try to do.
From a Catholic point of view, something like councils and committees that you have talked about are very rare, because we don't have something like that, because all the Catholic churches stays together. Then they have their sub communities, but they are all part of the same stuff. So more or less, how does this councils and committees works for justice, reconciliation, and social justice?
I think one of the things is they often actually speak to Parliament. I don't think it's like that anymore, but we actually had a seat in Parliament at a stage, even though our church and state is completely split from one another. And I don't think our say almost has as much. But I remember during COVID, the church councils, or the South African Council of Churches spoke to the presidency, and they spoke quite a bit on what's happening while people are experiencing loss and they can't mourn people. So they are very interactive actually with the government on the one side. But then I think there's quite a few institutions or non-profit organizations that's linked to churches, linked to the Dutch Reformed Church, for example, is an organization called I Am. They work with LGBTQ people to also make a place, or maybe rather, there's obviously a place, but to help people who are a bit awkward about it, to understand and get empathy for it. I also think so our government works that we have the Parliament, the presidency, but then each province has different municipalities, and in each municipality there is also elected people who run that part of the country or the province. And I think there's also a lot of interaction where the church can also have a voice to say, but let's also think of these people, let's also think of these people. So I think most of the work happens through NGOs. But I almost want to say reconciliation is almost not really the biggest issue at the moment. I think the poverty and the unemployment and the very big gap between the rich and the poor is actually where more need is needed at the moment. So I almost want to say, and well, that's my experience only, that we focus a lot of our attention there. And I think a lot of attention is also focused on early childhood development, because that's one of the ways of transforming. If you can get children educated, well, that is the hope. There's a bit of chance for growth.
Since we have some more minutes, I wanted to ask you a thing. Before you talked about mixed feelings for Christianity and for churches in South Africa. I wanted to ask you, which are the hot topics that make people feel mixed feelings about their faith? For example, here in Italy, we have big issues inside the Catholic Church regarding gender roles in church, and especially the role of women, because we don't have women ministries. So this is a big problem. And then the other big issue is the relationship between Catholic Church and queer people, because our church is very judgmental and adverse LGBTQ plus people. So which are the hot topics in South Africa Church, for your experience, of course?
So you spoke about queer people. We in our congregation, I think each different institution has different names for it. In our church, we speak of same-sex marriages or relationships. But I mean, it's much more than that. But that was almost like the entry point. It's been a hot topic for many years. For the past, I think 6-7 years, we have been ordaining people who are homosexual or of different sexualities. Our minister at our church is in a same-sex relationship, but it isn't easy for everyone. So that is one of the topics, but I think it's almost cooled down a bit. Although the Dutch Reformed Church is the only church who does that I know of at the moment. The Anglican Church might also, but I'm not exactly sure. But I think we really started that conversation in the media, and it wasn't always very nice. For example, in my class when I was studying, one of my very good friends was one of the first people to come out to the church to say that she is homosexual, and for many years she had no place in the church, and eventually after a lot of advocating, she almost was part of the people who got it right, that we do now ordain homosexual people, but she's just eventually said now she's tired of it. She doesn't really want anything to do with the church anymore. And I think our legacy with apartheid is a big issue as well. I think a lot of people was hurt by it very much, and even though I think our stance on that has changed 100%, there are some, especially in more rural settings and more conservative parts of the country, people are still hesitant for change. And I think the fact that we're not changing is killing the church. And it doesn't mean we have to adapt to the world, but opening ourselves up to what God tells us is difficult for us, because we like to listen to our own opinions rather than God's opinion, I think. I'm trying to think of other topics. I think, and I think that happened in Europe before it happened. Yes, a lot of secularization is happening, and I think people have also been hurt, not necessarily by hot topics, but just by ways people from church have treated them, but they don't really want anything to do with it anymore. I think at a certain stage, so the time of apartheid and nationalism came with a lot of black and white. So for a long time, people, and especially the church, told people, this is how you're supposed to believe, this is how things are supposed to be. And I think a lot of people think that is still the opinion of the church, which I really don't think it is. But that perception makes people not want to be a part of that community.
Thank you very much for your answers, for your time, for being here with me in Senza mulini. It was a pleasure hearing you talk about South Africa's spirituality and spiritual community. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you so much.
Grazie per aver ascoltato fino a qui. Questa è Senza mulini, storie di chiese plurali. Per esplorare modi molteplici di vivere il cristianesimo in giro per il mondo, continua a leggere la newsletter e ci rivediamo tra 2 settimane.